Hi, everybody. Yesterday we found out a little bit more about Louisiana's grandma, and when we left off, they were getting ready to eat some tuna at Louisiana's house. Here, sorry, you know how my hair always does. All right. They sat on the floor of the dining room underneath a gigantic chandelier. "It's very pretty if we turn it on," said Louisiana, "but right now we can't turn it on because we don't have electricity." The lack of furniture in the room made the words they said to each other sound funny. Everything echoed and bounced. They ate tuna fish directly out of the can, and they drank water out of little paper cups that had riddles printed in red on their sides. "They're supposed to have the answer to the riddle on the bottom, but they made a mistake and forgot to put the answer there," said Louisiana, "and that's why we got thousands of those cups for free, because they don't have the answer. Isn't that something?" "Yeah," said Beverly, "that's something." Raymie held up her paper cup and read the side of her cup out loud. "What has 3 legs, no arms, and reads the paper all day long?" She looked at the bottom of the cup. There was nothing there. "See," said Louisiana, "there's no answer." "It's a stupid question," said Beverly. Outside there was a flash of lightning and then a large clap of thunder. The chandelier shook. "Ooh," said the grandmother, "it's going to be a big one." "It's lucky that we're safe inside and all together," said Louisiana. The rain started to come down in sheets, and the dining room, which was painted a deep blue, became a murky, underwater kind of place. Raymie wondered if they had maybe somehow journeyed to a different world, the 4 of them together. It had been such a strange day. "Granny," said Louisiana. "Yes, darling." "I miss Archie." "Now don't get started on that. Remember what I said. There's no point in looking back." "But I miss him," said Louisiana. Her lower lip trembled. "They're taking good care of him at the very friendly animal center. I'm certain of it." Beverly snorted. Louisiana started to cry. "Don't think about it, darling," said the grandmother. "Some things just do not bear thinking about. Eat your tuna fish. Ponder your riddle." Louisiana cried harder. Beverly put her hand on Louisiana's back. She leaned over and whispered something in her ear. "That's true," said Louisiana. "We did succeed." "Succeed?" said the grandmother. "What did you succeed at?" "Look," said Beverly, "my father's a cop. I know things." "My goodness." The grandmother sat up straighter. "How interesting. May I inquire, is your father a police officer in our fair city?" "No," said Beverly. "Where then?" "New York City," said Beverly. "New York City," said Raymie. "He's not here? He's in New York City?" She couldn't believe it. Beverly's father was gone. Beverly Topinski was fatherless too. Raymie stared at Beverly, and Beverly stared back at her in a very fierce kind of way. "I'm going there, okay?" said Beverly. "Just as soon as I'm old enough. I'm moving to New York. I've already run away twice. One time I made it all the way to Atlanta." "Atlanta?" shrieked Louisiana. "In the meantime," said Beverly, "I'm stuck here with you people, doing stupid things like looking for library books under old people's beds." Beverly put down her tuna fish can and got up and walked out of the dining room. Raymie felt her soul shrink. "My goodness," said Louisiana's grandmother. "I think her heart is broken," said Louisiana. Raymie's soul shrank further. "Beware of the broken-hearted," said the grandmother, "for they will lead you astray." Outside it started to rain even harder. That's all of us, though, Granny, isn't it?" said Louisiana over the noise of the rain. "Aren't we all broken-hearted?" Chapter 27. The ride back to town was not fast. They still did not bother to stop for stop signs, but they went past them slowly, and there was no signaling. There was no singing, sorry. Beverly sat with her arms crossed over her chest. Louisiana looked out the window, and Raymie stared down at a bright and shining path, the life of Florence Nightingale, and flexed her toes. But she didn't really know what her objectives were anymore. She was too sad for objectives. "Don't forget," said Louisiana when Raymie got out of the car, "we succeeded, but there's another wrong that still needs to be righted." Raymie looked down at the book in her hand. "Okay," she said, "I'll see you Monday at Idenese." "Yes, you will," said Louisiana. "The rancheros will ride again, I promise you." Beverly sat very still, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't look at Raymie. She didn't say anything at all. Raymie closed the door to the station wagon as quietly as she could and climbed the front steps to her house. Before she went inside, she turned and watched the car go up the street. There was black smoke pouring out of the exhaust pipe. Raymie stared at the smoke, willing it to shape itself into something that had meaning. A letter, a promise. She stared until the car disappeared. "Where in the world have you been?" said her mother. She was holding open the front door. Behind her was the bookcase, filled with all of Raymie's father's books, and behind that was the yellow expanse of the shag carpet, which seemed to go on forever. Said Raymie, reading to the elderly. Come inside, said her mother. Something has happened. What? Said Raymie. What happened? She felt her soul form itself into a small, frightened ball. Mrs. Borkowski, said her mother. Mrs. Borkowski, repeated Raymie. She held Florence Nightingale very close to her chest, as if the lady with the lamp could protect her from whatever it was that her mother was getting ready to say. Mrs. Borkowski is dead. We'll read one more chapter. Chapter 28. Raymie stared at the yellow carpet. She stared at the bookcase. She couldn't look at her mother's face. She felt more than anything else bewildered. How could Mrs. Borkowski be dead? There's no funeral, said her mother, but there will be a memorial service tomorrow at the Finch Auditorium. Mrs. Borkowski's daughter is taking care of things, and that's what she said her mother wanted, a memorial service, no funeral. Who knows why? Raymie's mother sighed. Mrs. Borkowski was always so strange. But how can she be dead? Said Raymie. She was old, said Raymie's mother. She had a heart attack. Oh. Raymie went into the kitchen. She picked up the phone and called Clark Family Insurance. The phone rang. Raymie looked up at the sunburst clock on the kitchen wall. The clock said it was 5:15. Sometimes Mrs. Sylvester stayed late on Saturdays, typing things up. The phone rang again. Please, said Raymie. She tried to flex her toes, but her feet were frozen, numb. Her toes wouldn't move at all. Mr. Stephanopoulos had never said what you should do if you couldn't flex your toes. The phone rang a third time. Mrs. Borkowski was dead. Clark Family Insurance, said Mrs. Sylvester in her cartoon bird voice. How may we protect you? Raymie said nothing. Hello, said Mrs. Sylvester. Raymie couldn't speak. Is this Raymie Clark? Asked Mrs. Sylvester. Raymie stood in the kitchen and nodded her head. She held on to the phone and stared at the sunburst clock and thought about Mrs. Sylvester's gigantic candy jar. It was so bright. It was as if it held light instead of candy corn. It was a very comforting thing to think about, a jar filled with light. Said Raymie, but she couldn't get any further than that. The sentence she needed to say was jammed up inside of her. Maybe the words were somewhere in her toes. Also, her soul felt incredibly small. She wasn't even sure where it was. She searched around inside of herself, trying to locate it. There, said Mrs. Sylvester. Said Raymie. He'll come back, honey, said Mrs. Sylvester. Raymie realized that Mrs. Sylvester thought that she was upset about her father leaving. Mrs. Sylvester didn't know that Mrs. Borkowski was dead. Something about this made Raymie's soul even smaller and her toes even stiffer. It occurred to her that nobody really knew what anybody else was upset about, and that seemed like a terrible thing. She missed Louisiana. She missed Beverly Topinski. She had another terrible thought. Where had Mrs. Borkowski's soul gone? Where was it? Raymie closed her eyes and saw a gigantic seabird fly by. Its wings were massive, huge, and dark. They didn't look like an angel wing at all. Mrs. Borkowski, she whispered. What's that, honey? Said Mrs. Sylvester. Mrs. Borkowski, said Raymie, louder. I don't know who Mrs. Borkowski is, dear, said Mrs. Sylvester. This is Mrs. Sylvester, and everything's going to be fine, just fine. Okay, said Raymie. Suddenly it was hard to breathe. Mrs. Borkowski was dead. Mrs. Borkowski was dead. Pfft. Raymie's mother did not talk on the way to the memorial service. She sat behind the wheel of the car exactly the same way she sat on the couch, staring straight ahead, grim-faced. The sun was shining very brightly, but the whole world looked gray, as if everything had faded overnight. They drove past Central Florida Tire. There was a gigantic banner in the window of the store that said, You could become Little Miss Central Florida Tire, 1975. Raymie read the words and was alarmed to discover that they didn't make any sense to her. Become Little Miss Central Florida Tire? What did that mean? The words promised her nothing. Raymie looked down at Florence Nightingale. She had brought the book with her because it hadn't seemed like a good idea to leave it behind. What's with the book? Said her mother, still staring straight ahead. It's a library book, said Raymie. Uh-huh. It's about Florence Nightingale. She was a nurse. She walked a bright and shining path. Good for her. Raymie looked down at the book. She stared at Florence Nightingale's lamp. She was holding it up high over her head. It almost looked like she was carrying a star. Do you think that if you were in a deep hole in the ground, and it was daylight, and you looked up out of the deep hole at the sky, you could see stars even though it was daylight and the sun was out? What? Said her mother. No. What are you talking about? Raymie didn't know if she believed it either, but she wanted to believe it. She wanted it to be true. Never mind, she said to her mother, and they drove the rest of the way to the Finch Auditorium in silence.